What's up everybody, you're watching JoeBox TV, and today I bring you the second installment of the Division Breakdown series. Today we're talking about the big boys in the heavyweight division. The most storied division in boxing that has brought us the legendary Jack Johnson, Rocky Marciano, Jack Dempsey, going back to the older days, Joe Louis, possibly the greatest heavyweight of all time, Muhammad Ali, who many consider to be the GOAT. We saw those trilogies between Ali and Frazier, the two fights between Ali and Liston, Ali Foreman, Foreman Frazier, and then a little bit later we had Larry Holmes. In the 80s we had the rise of Mike Tyson, and then eventually him getting upset by Buster Douglas in one of the biggest upsets in sports history. Evander Holyfield and his trilogy with Riddick Bowe. More recently we've got Lennox Lewis and his rise. We got the Klitschko brothers, and in today's era we have the likes of Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua, and most recently Alexander Usyk coming up from cruiserweight. Got a lot to talk about. I'm going to break down my personal top 10 heavyweight rankings, and then we're going to talk about some of the best prospects in the heavyweight division. We're going to talk about the fringe contenders that are just outside the top 10 that could potentially break back into the top 10. I'm going to talk about some of the veterans that have been in the division for quite some time and are pretty well-known names and may have one last shot. I'm going to talk about a few of the blue chips of the division that are either coming from different sports or moving up from different weight divisions. And finally, I'm going to talk about the best matchups that I would like to see. In last week's series with the lightweights, I counted down from 1 to 10, but to add a little bit of intrigue here, and to build on some of the suspense, I'm going to count down from 10 to 1. So starting at number 10, we've got Frank Sanchez, 21-0 from Cuba. He fights like your typical Cuban boxer, very technically sound, good amateur pedigree. He perhaps scored the biggest win of his career on the Fury versus Wilder undercard, beating Efe Ajagba in a battle between two unbeaten heavyweights. His career has kind of taken a bit of a pause since then. He's stepped back down in competition a little bit, fighting veteran fighters, tough guys, but no big names and no serious contenders. Since the Ajagba win, he does have a very defense-first style. He is very calculated, like a lot of Cuban fighters are, and they're very technically sound. So he might not be the most exhilarating fighter to watch, but he has the kind of style that can give anyone trouble. Coming in at number 9, we've got Joseph Parker, perhaps the best boxer today out of New Zealand, and he certainly fought the elite fighters in the heavyweight division. Perhaps his most notable fight coming against Anthony Joshua. He came up just short in a competitive decision loss. He fought Dillian White as he started to lose a little bit of momentum, and his most recent loss came against the rugged Joe Joyce, who is fast on the rise in the division, and I'll bring him up in just a little bit. Parker has always been a sound technical fighter. He moves well, he's got good pop on his punches. Earlier in his career when he was in that prospect stage, he had some highlight reel knockouts, but his identity is mainly as a mover and someone who likes to control range with the jab. I thought he missed a lot of opportunities to exploit the very defensively flawed Joyce, but ultimately, like a lot of opponents of Joyce, he just got worn down by the constant pressure and the jabbing. And in Parker's one win since that fight, he did look like he was starting to lose a lot of momentum against Jack Massey, which he had to grind out a tough, hard-fought decision victory. He still has the style to give just about anyone trouble, if not beat them. But he does have a win over Andy Ruiz several years ago in a very close fight. And he has a resume. He's been in with a lot of good fighters, but I'd say out of all the fighters in my top 10, he probably has the least momentum working with him. But we shall see. Coming in at number 8, we've got Luis Ortiz, who at 43 years old is still one of the most lethal punchers in the sport. He's very technically sound, like most Cuban fighters are, again. And he had 2 absolutely exhilarating fights against Deontay Wilder, particularly the first one, in a fight, what I thought was probably the fight of the year during that year. And he ultimately fell short in 2 fights against Deontay Wilder. He was fast on the rise before those 2 fights, and particularly in the second fight, he was handily beating Wilder, but we all know Wilder has that great eraser, that right hand. And he had a few bounce-back victories after that against lesser opponents, and then ultimately in his last fight, he was pretty much outboxing and schooling Andy Ruiz whenever he wasn't on the canvas. And Ruiz, as we all know, has that power as well. As we saw in the first fight against Anthony Joshua, Ruiz knocked down Ortiz multiple times and had enough good moments in between that, even though he was primarily being outboxed by Ortiz. So just the multiple knockdowns were ultimately the separation that Ruiz needed to get the decision victory. But at 43 years old, you do have to wonder if it's been Ortiz's last hurrah, or does he have one more great showing in him? He has the power still. Coming in at number 7, we got Dillian Whyte, who has one of the best resumes in the heavyweight division. He's been in with the likes of Derek Chisora, Lucas Brown, Alexander Povetkin in 2 fights after having avenged the loss. And he did fall short against the likes of Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. Certainly no shame in that. I wasn't impressed with his effort against Fury. I thought he could have brought a little bit more to the table. He fought very safely, but he needed to really press Fury and try and get on the inside and bang him to the body. Of course, easier said than done, but I have seen Whyte fight with a little more passion, and I have to wonder if he may also be on the downside. That all being said, his resume is what keeps him comfortably in the top 10 here. And I think there's still some good fights out there for him, particularly against Joe Joyce, perhaps. I think that's a good matchup. Coming in at number 6, we have the aforementioned Andy Ruiz, who scored one of the biggest upsets in boxing history, certainly up there. And as I'm showing in the graphic here, he's one of the most deceptively dangerous fighters in the game. Obviously not a flawless physique, but he has deceptively quick hands, and a lot of opponents, including Anthony Joshua, most notably, underestimated him. He's a good combination puncher. He's not very quick on his feet, but he knows how to let his hands fly, and he's got excellent power, as he showed once again against Luis Ortiz. There are negotiations rumored to be taking place for a bout between him and Deontay Wilder. That would certainly be intriguing. In the second fight against Anthony Joshua, he put on too much weight. He's already a fairly flabby fighter, no disrespect, but certainly not a fighter who needs to be putting on more weight, and I think that certainly hurt him in the rematch against Anthony Joshua. He did slim back down, and he looked pretty good against Luis Ortiz, so an intriguing future for him. Coming in at number 5, we've got Joe Joyce, who scored the biggest victory of his career against Joseph Parker. He's also beaten Daniel Dubois, who prior to that fight was one of the most intriguing prospects in the heavyweight division. He just grinds you down. A lot of people have compared his style to that of a George Foreman. Like, he's not the most technically sound fighter, but he throws these wide clubbing shots. He'll back you up behind his ramrod jab. And he throws these unconventional haymaker type shots from the most awkward angles and really knows how to hurt you. With all due respect, he's one of the slowest heavyweight fighters that I've seen in terms of legitimate contenders that have established themselves in the division. He's very defensively flawed and very slow. So you may wonder how he's able to have the success that he has. Well, he understands range and he knows how to just pummel you with that jab. That jab keeps a lot of fighters from being able to effectively get past it and do damage. And when he's also able to rough you up on the inside as well. There's something about him that's just so unconventional that opponents haven't quite figured out yet. They figured out how to win rounds against him, but ultimately not survive. He's one of the most tenacious fighters in the sport. And his will has the potential, with the will and the determination that he has, makes him a feared opponent for any fighter in the division. Coming in at number 4, we got Anthony Joshua, who I would say is the closest thing to Lennox Lewis. He's a huge superstar in England, and he's one of the most electrifying prospects earlier in his career. Highlight reel knockouts, tremendous punching power, good build, and that came to a halt certainly against Andy Ruiz, but he was able to exact revenge against Ruiz, just like Lennox Lewis did against the likes of Oliver McCall and Hasim Rahman when he lost both of those fights originally, came back and beat them in the rematches. Joshua was able to do that against Andy Ruiz. Ultimately not against Alexander Usyk, however. Losing both of those fights. He put up certainly a good effort in the second fight, but he came up short once again. He had the game plan of being more aggressive, using his physical tools, but still came up short against the technical prowess of Usyk. He's going to be changing trainers once again to Derek James, after having trained most recently with Robert Garcia, to try and really get the most out of his physicality and come forward style. I'm interested to see how this works for Anthony Joshua. Derek James is certainly one of the most accomplished trainers. He's certainly done a tremendous job with the likes of Errol Spence and the Charlo brothers and Frank Martin. He really knows how to get the most out of pressure fighters and build them to where they are technically sound enough, but yet also able to use their physicality and use their aggression to hunt their opponents down. So I'm interested to see how this changeup goes for Anthony Joshua. Even with the 2 losses to Usyk, he's certainly among the most marketable fighters in the sport, and he's still a superstar. Coming in at number 3, I've got Deontay Wilder. Now, I pull no punches when I say this, pun intended there, but Deontay Wilder's probably the biggest puncher in the sport. He certainly has the one biggest punch in the sport, his right hand, which has terrorized opponents. He's knocked out everyone that he's been in the ring with, and I'd argue, even though he doesn't have a win over him, he knocked out Tyson Fury as well, at least for 6-7 seconds. Fury was unconscious on the canvas. Ultimately, Fury sprung up like the Undertaker, and we all know how that went. That fight ended in a draw. Then in 2 thrilling fights after that, Fury wore down Deontay Wilder, broke him down, and was able to use his physicality more. It was a couple devastating losses for Deontay Wilder, but he did bounce back most recently with the first round TKO of Robert Helenius, and he's probably the most dangerous fighter in the sport when it comes to just one-punch knockout power. So it's not like he's a very technically sound fighter at all. A lot of his successes just primarily came at the result of one-punch knockout power, and you don't see that too often where guys are able to get away with that with power alone. One element that I'll add to this that I think a lot of people don't realize, he is a bronze medalist, so it's not like he doesn't know what he's doing in there. He does have some technical smarts, at least. He might not be the most fluid fighter, but despite him being kind of robotic in the way he moves, he knows how to find opportunities. He knows where to land. He knows what to throw. As I previously mentioned, negotiations are in place for him to fight Andy Ruiz potentially, but I think the most intriguing matchup might be Anthony Joshua, and I'll get into that a little bit, but that was once the fight to make, and I think with both of them coming up short on the biggest stage, them going up against each other again suddenly becomes a very marketable fight again. Moving on to number 2, we've got Alexander Usyk, who many would argue should be the undisputed champion after Tyson Fury briefly retired for the 100th time, only to quickly announce that he'll be coming back to the ring. At the time of that fight, Fury had retired, and Usyk and Joshua were the consensus 2 best fighters in the division. Usyk, the former undisputed cruiserweight champion, coming up to heavyweight, had only a couple fights in the division before he took on Anthony Joshua. A win against Chaz Witherspoon and a win against the rugged Derek Chisora. A lot of people thought he couldn't handle the physicality of Anthony Joshua, but he's one of the most technically skilled fighters, and he moves very, very well. As good as any other heavyweight in terms of agility. And his technical smarts were able to just confuse Anthony Joshua in a fairly one-sided fight in that first fight. Second fight was closer, but still, Usyk, being trained by Anatoly Lomachenko, has sort of that Ukrainian style similar to Lomachenko, where he's constantly moving, he's a southpaw, and he knows which angles to exploit his opponent with. And right now it appears that the biggest fight to make is going to be him against Tyson Fury. I don't know if that necessarily brings in more dollars than Fury versus Joshua, but right now it's the 2 best heavyweights. Coming in at number 1, of course, we've got the lineal heavyweight champion, Tyson Fury. He's one of the most charismatic fighters in the sport, if not the most charismatic. Very animated style as well. Perhaps the most awkward and unconventional style that we've seen in quite some time. He moves deceptively well for his size at 6'9". It's the same style that was able to end the near decade-long reign of Vladimir Klitschko several years back in 2015, and Fury's certainly built on that momentum. He of course had a few-year hiatus, suffering from depression and obesity. He had those issues that he was facing, but eventually came out of it and had those 3 fights against Deontay Wilder. And a few fights in between that against lesser competition, which he was able to roll over. And at the moment, he's coming off of what I would call several fake retirements, where Tyson Fury, he's done this before. He does this shtick where he announces his retirement and then a few months later announces his return. Hey, I'm fighting again. And I think I've finally figured out what he's doing. He's trying to get the most money he can out of his next possible fight. In other words, he's trying to market himself as much as he possibly can. And people might say, well, he's pricing himself out. Well, with him being the man, the lineal heavyweight champion, is there really a limit to how much he can price himself at? I mean, this is my theory. Tyson Fury says, hey, I'm retiring from the sport unless you'll give me X number of dollars, what, 150 million, let's say. And if you don't give me that, I'm not going to fight again. And as hungry as boxing fans get to see the fights that they want to see, and who can blame them, someone is eventually going to offer him that money. So that's kind of my theory as to why Tyson Fury does what he does. A lot of times you can't really believe what he says instantly, but there's certainly a method to his madness that a lot of people aren't really able to put their finger on. But I like the guy. I think he's good for the sport as long as he keeps doing what he's been doing when he gets in the ring, which is bring the best version of himself. And he completely destroyed Dillian Whyte in his last fight. Pardon me. In his last two fights, he completely destroyed Dillian Whyte and Derek Chisora. I'm not sure why the third Chisora fight needed to happen after Fury won so convincingly in the first couple fights, but sometimes that's how boxing is. I mean, but ultimately, the fight between him and Usyk is the fight to make now. Now let's talk about the prospects. The best prospect in the division, I know this isn't necessarily a contrarian opinion, but I genuinely believe that Jared Anderson is probably the best prospect in the division, just going by the eye test. He has the speed, he has the movement, he can move fairly well at 6'4", and he of course has a dynamic punching power. And in his most recent fight, he fought the veteran Jerry Forrest, who's given a lot of fighters like Zhang Zhile of China a lot of trouble. He fought to a draw with Zhang, and he also had a close fight against Jermaine Franklin, and he had a close fight, a draw against Michael Hunter, Jerry Forrest did. But ultimately, Anderson blew him out. He's also fought a lot of fighters from Eastern Europe that were undefeated prospects and had no problem with them. He's a total package. I am a little bit curious to see how he fights off of the jab a little bit more against more aggressive opponents, and also guys that are a bit taller than him, like a Fury or a Wilder, that are 6'6" or 6'7", or in Fury's case 6'9", how is he able to get on the inside effectively? Because he's not the most aggressive fighter, but he is very physically talented, and he's got all the weapons. So I think the only question is, how well can he get on the inside and do damage? How well is he able to maneuver his way on the inside against a taller opponent? He has sparred with Tyson Fury, so that certainly is a plus that will give him that learning curve. Now, coming up next, we've got Arslanbek Makhmudov, who is kind of flying under the radar for a while, but coming out of Russia, he brings that rugged Russian style. He's one of the most fierce punchers in the sport. He finally went the distance against Carlos Takam, but he's an absolutely menacing puncher. He had no problem with some washed up bigger names like Sam Peter, who back in the day were dynamic punchers, but are way past their prime now. He fought several of those veteran type fighters, and now he's slowly starting to step up his competition. He won a decision over Carlos Takam. He didn't look great, but he didn't look bad either. He's certainly got some technical improvements, but his punching power makes him a threat to anybody. Next we've got Bakodir Jalalov, the Olympic gold medalist from the 2020 Olympics, most notably defeating Richard Torres in those Olympics in the final bout. He's an absolute monster. He's a long, tall southpaw standing at 6'7", who really knows how to use range, and he's got deceptively quick feet. He knows how to make you miss with his feet by pulling back, taking a step back, and countering you with that vicious left hand. He had a devastating knockout against Jack Mulawai, and most recently against Curtis Harper, who's a veteran in the game. And he's slowly starting to step up his competition, but he's still fairly early in his pro career. Obviously, he has the amateur pedigree, being a gold medalist. He is there to be hit if you can get on the inside. He's not the most elusive fighter, but he is quick enough on his feet to make you miss and counter. And he knows how to use his range at 6'7". So if he develops more technically, we could be looking at somewhat of a Klitschko prototype. Speaking of which, we've got Ivan Ditchko, who I think is also a bit of a Klitschko prototype. He fights similar to Klitschko, and he's coming out of Kazakhstan. He's a fierce puncher, long, tall, knows how to control range. He is another interesting prospect as well, who I would like to see step up in competition more, perhaps against someone like a Jerry Forrest, or a Curtis Harper, or a Nathan Gorman, or someone like that. We've also got David Adelaide of Great Britain, who's a fierce puncher. I do think that he gives... David Adelaide does remind me a little bit of Deontay Wilder in the way he moves. He primarily relies on his big right hand, which I think is the biggest comparison. He is more fluid than Wilder. He's got decent head movement, but he fights at a slow pace and primarily relies on that one punch. That could be his downfall if he's not able to land that one punch. But as he progresses more and he steps up his competition, I think that will help his creativity a little bit. It will open up his arsenal perhaps. It'll force him to find those openings if he steps up in competition. We shall see. He's still relatively young. We've also got, in terms of prospects, we've got Fabio Wardley of Great Britain as well, who's an undefeated prospect. Very patient fighter, fights at kind of a slow pace, and although I like that he's patient, he is a little bit too easy to hit for me at times. That may be his downfall. But looking at the plus side, he certainly has dynamic punching power and is very poised and composed. He's not reckless by any means, so he's got a good punch variety when he lets his hands go. Ultimately, he needs to learn how to work off the jab a little bit more, be a little bit busier with his hands. Next, I'm going to talk about two Australian prospects that are both undefeated that could make some noise in the division. And like Joseph Parker, both of these fighters could be the next big thing out of the continent of Oceania. As it pertains to Dempsey McKean, he's a southpaw, long, tall, knows how to use his range, and he's got a little bit of Usyk in him. He's got not tremendous punching power, but he's 22-0. He's beaten some decent fighters at the domestic level in Australia, and his technical style will certainly serve him well as he climbs up the ladder in the division. Ultimately, the question is, when will he reach his cap? In the heavyweight division, you need one of two things. You need to be a master boxer, or you need to be an absolutely dynamic puncher who knows how to find those openings. So I'm not sure if I would consider Dempsey McKean to be a master boxer just yet, but he's certainly very technically sound, and that could take him a long way if he continues to progress. As it pertains to Justis Huni, he is a very rugged fighter, a terrific inside fighter who fights behind that peekaboo guard and can really rip power punches well on the inside. He knows how to get leverage on those punches. But I think his downfall is going to be his lack of defensive capabilities. He has a lot to improve there. He does get hit quite a bit from what I've seen. Of course, in the heavyweight division, power can take you a long way. And Huni certainly has that, but I'm not sure I see him getting past the fringe contender, outside of the top 10 contender status. I'm not sure how far he can really go. As it pertains to Mike Balogun, he's a southpaw from Washington, D.C. He's got some of the heaviest hands in the division, and one of his recent opponents, Trey Lip Morrison, the son of Tommy Morrison, was going to be the next big thing, potentially. But just like back in the day, Tommy Morrison's loss to Ray Mercer, which ended quickly in the first round, his fight against Trey Lip Morrison's fight against Balogun ended quickly in 2 rounds. And he's got absolutely electric punching power, particularly with the left hand. He can really hurt you. He's not the most technically sound fighter, but he's got a lot of physical talent. He's a former football player for the 49ers, and time isn't on his side, nor his height. He's fairly short at 6 foot for the heavyweight division, and he's 39 years old. With that being said, he still has some time for a few big fights. He's got a big fight in March coming up against Murat Gassiev, the former cruiserweight title holder, and who's recently moved up to heavyweight. That'll be a tremendous fight between 2 big punchers. Some more prospects. We've got Zhan Kosabutsky out of Kazakhstan. He's a flat-footed fighter with a lot of power. He's tall, and he's got a lot of power with that left hand. I think his vulnerabilities are his lack of foot movement, but he is slow and kind of plodding, but he makes up for it with his punching power. He knows how to catch you, and he's very precise. I think he could potentially be exploited by quicker fighters with foot movement and a long jab. But again, definitely room for improvement. We'll see how he develops. George Arias is looking to be sort of the next Mike Tyson, the Dominican Mike Tyson, or at least he fights as though he is. He's small for heavyweight. I have seen that he's looking to fight at Bridgerweight, which is the new WBC division. I don't think we need any more weight divisions, but the WBC's a mess. That's another story for another video. Nevertheless, he's a very solid prospect, undefeated, very aggressive, good, quick head movement, allows him to get inside and penetrate opponents on the inside. and he defeated Cassius Chaney in the biggest victory of his career, who was another fellow prospect. Lanier Pero out of Cuba is your typical Cuban-style fighter, technically sound, but he's certainly not a defensive mastermind. He's able to make up for it with his power, as we saw in his last fight. I thought he was getting picked apart by Viktor Faust of Ukraine, who's a taller fighter with a good punch output. He was certainly way behind on the scorecards, but Pero has that eraser, he has that left hand to bail himself out. And he's not a bad technical fighter, but he's not very active. Rafael Ekpejiori of Nigeria is a vicious puncher from Nigeria, and he's 15-0, 14 KOs. He hasn't faced the best competition yet. He's faced a lot of smaller fighters, and I certainly think he's got a lot of technical aspects to his game that he has to improve on. If he can have a greater punch arsenal and be a little bit more selective with his punches, a little bit less reckless, he could keep himself out of trouble. But very reckless, very raw, but with a lot of power. Evgeny Romanov of Russia is another vicious puncher, very stocky at 6 foot, very strong build. Ultimately, his lack of size may catch up to him, and he is 37 years old, so time's not on his side either. In the amateurs, he was one of the few to stop Deontay Wilder, all the way back in the amateur days. He hasn't had the most exposure in his pro career, but he's kind of flown under the radar, but he very may well get a big fight soon, as he's nearing 40 and the time to make a move is now. He's got an entertaining style, vicious puncher, could give a lot of guys some problems. Let's talk about some of the fringe contenders just outside the top 10. We've got Michael Hunter Jr. He's been inactive recently. He did have a fight against Fury coming up. That ultimately got canceled. He's got that Olympic pedigree. He was an Olympian. He's got pretty good power, good boxing skills. He hasn't been able to beat any elite names yet, but he's certainly been in there with the top names and gotten that experience. I think he's a level below the top of the heavyweight division, but is going to beat a lot of guys below the top 10. Martin Bakole is a rugged fighter from the Congo who just beat Tony Yoka in a big upset victory. Tony Yoka of France was an Olympian, one of the biggest prospects in the division leading up to that loss, but Bakole, he reminds me of Derek Chisora a little bit, the way he fights. Good puncher, steady aggression. He'll beat some problems for a lot of fighters. He did lose against Michael Hunter, who I just mentioned, but seems to have gotten his career back on track now. Filip Hrgovic was one of the most feared punchers, and still is one of the most feared punchers in the division, undefeated out of Croatia. He recently had the biggest test of his career against Zhang Zile of China, who likewise was also an undefeated heavyweight prospect with knockout power. In a showdown between the undefeated heavyweights on the undercard of the Joshua Usyk fight, they fought to a draw. Back and forth action. It was a seesaw fight. One guy wins the round, the other guy wins the next round. It was that kind of fight. Constant shifts in momentum between two big punchers. And I certainly wouldn't mind seeing a rematch. It looks like they're going to go separate ways for the time being. Zhang is getting ready to face an even bigger test against Joe Joyce in the spring. And win or lose, I wouldn't mind seeing a rematch against Hrgovic. Daniel Dynamite Dubois was one of the biggest prospects in the heavyweight division before coming up short against Joe Joyce. He was beating Joe Joyce, but like a lot of Joyce's opponents, he just breaks you down, and Dubois suffered a fractured orbital bone and ultimately could not continue. He did rebound against Kevin Lorena recently, and a very strange fight. He went down 3 times in the first round, citing an injury to his knee, but eventually, with some help from the referee in some odd circumstances, was able to recover and get Lorena out of there in the 3rd round with a vicious uppercut. He's a very aggressive fighter. He's not very seasoned, or at least he doesn't fight that way. He's a banger. He looks to brawl and get you out of there. He likes to throw the clubbing overhand right and just spam that punch, but that may be his vulnerabilities. Efe Ajagba was a top prospect from Nigeria, looking to follow in the footsteps of Sam Peter and maybe make it even bigger than him and become the next Nigerian world champion. He fell short in the biggest test of his career against Frank Sanchez, my number 10 ranked heavyweight. He went the distance. It was a close fight. He did get dropped once on a flash knockdown. He's got a lot of power. He's defensively flawed and not very fast on his feet, which has been, at least against Sanchez, was his downfall. But there's certainly room for technical improvements, and if he can patch up those, he can certainly progress. Ali Eren Demirzen of Turkey is a fighter that has rebounded in his career with 2 big wins against Gerald Washington, who he outlasted in a tremendous fight, and most recently against Adam Kovnatsky, who was one of the big up-and-comers in the division as well, up until losing 2 fights against Robert Helenius. And most recently, Ali Eren Demirzen gave Kovnatsky that 3rd loss. Kovnatsky is now at a critical moment in his career where he may be 1 fight away from retirement if he hasn't already decided to go that route. Demirzen doesn't do a lot that special, but he is a very rugged fighter with solid power who can certainly grind you down if you don't get him out of there early. Otto Wallin of Sweden was an undefeated prospect for a while before he suddenly got the opportunity of a lifetime against Tyson Fury. He was almost able to capitalize on it. He cut Fury, gave Fury a lot of trouble with that awkward southpaw style, but ultimately Fury's arsenal and variety of punches, the unconventional style of Fury, and the heart allowed Fury to pursue through that nasty gash and outlast Wallin for a unanimous decision victory. Wallin has had a bit of a stall in his career since then, although he did beat Dominic Brazil in a unanimous decision win. So he's certainly still very much in the game and is a dangerous opponent for anyone. Richard Torres is one of the more well-known prospects coming out of top rank boxing, and he's a silver medalist from the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, coming up short against Bakodir Jalilov. He is a very rugged fighter, very aggressive, tremendous power. He is a bit short, and that may catch up to him, because unless if you've got Mike Tyson level head movement and foot speed to allow you to get inside, that is going to catch up to you in this division. However, I think he could certainly make even more of a name for himself, win some big fights, enough to get him to contender status, but I think he'll come up short at the elite level. I have been wrong before though, we shall see. I see that in his fights he spams the overhand left a lot. I would like to see a little bit more selectiveness with his punch variety, but tremendous power. I want to see him step up his competition because he's very entertaining to watch. Damian Kaniba is a very green prospect from Poland, who I saw him fight actually in West Virginia recently against Santander Salgado, who he stopped in the first round. Kind of raw, not super technically sound, but he's very tall and he's got that punching power. He's kind of a question mark for me until he gets tested a little bit more against some more formidable opponents. Adam Stewart is a fighter from Arizona who I followed for quite some time. He was undefeated for a while until he came up short against Helaman Ogwin in a fight he wasn't expected to lose, but he got cut. To be fair, he did suffer a bad gash, and that ultimately was the downfall. He had trouble fighting through that cut. I think in a rematch he takes care of Ogwin. He did rebound with several knockout victories since then. He's certainly got the height and he's got the punching power. I would like to see him tone up on his arsenal, give himself a little bit more variety, but he certainly could make some noise in the division as well. Some of the veterans in the division are, of course, Derek Delboy Chisora. He's hung around this sport for quite some time, fighting the elite of the elite. He's usually coming up short against the elite fighters, but he beats everybody else. He beats anybody who's not a top contender, pretty much. And he recently overcame Kubrat Pulev in their second fight after losing the first fight to Pulev. He's a dangerous puncher, very formidable, good chin. He got the third fight against Tyson Fury and once again put up a good effort, but came up short as Fury utterly dominated. Chisora may be nearing the end of his career, but certainly wouldn't shock me to see him get another big fight and potentially capitalize on the opportunity, knowing his power. I personally wouldn't mind seeing a third fight between Chisora and Pulev at this stage of their careers. We've got Robert Helenius of Finland, who was recently knocked out in one round very violently and quickly with one punch by Deontay Wilder. No shame in that. Helenius was starting to rebound his career with 2 wins over previously undefeated Adam Kopnatsky. After Helenius had been on the downside for quite a bit, suffering several losses, but prior to that Wilder fight, he was working his way back into the ranks. Can he regain that momentum? We shall see. He's certainly long, tall, and knows how to work off his jab, and he's got solid power. So that will always help you in this division. Carlos Takam is one of those sturdy fighters coming out of Cameroon. Tremendous chin, can hang in there and has hung in there with a lot of elite fighters and gone the distance. He doesn't really have any elite wins on his record, but he's a tested veteran who is a good step up for a lot of young prospects, I think. Whether it's Jalelov or Jared Anderson or whoever. Johnny Rice is one of those big power punchers who's kind of revitalized his career with wins over Guido Vianelli and Michael Coffey twice. Not the most technically sound and not the busiest fighter, but can really catch you with that power. And it can be a game changer. He suffered a lot of losses early in his career, but he has rebounded. Chris Arreola hasn't officially announced his retirement. He is nearing the end, but he did give Andy Ruiz one heck of a fight in his most recent fight. Jerry Forrest is a southpaw with good power, who's hung in there and went the distance with some very good fighters, including Zhang Zile, Michael Hunter, and Jermaine Franklin, and made those all close fights. Unfortunately for him, he did get stopped quickly against Jared Anderson recently, but I still think he's a great test for a lot of these young prospects. Lucas Brown is a fighter from Australia who I think would be a good fighter to put up against one of these Australian prospects like Justus Huni or Dempsey McKean. Now for a few of the wild cards. Jarrell Miller was on quite a run as a contender before failing multiple drug tests. He almost had that fight against Anthony Joshua before he got busted for PEDs. He's been given second chances and failed them, but he has won his last couple fights, and this may very well be his last shot. Some promoter's gonna give him another big shot, I can guarantee it, as long as he stays clean. He is a bit of a wannabe James Toney, I've always thought. He has a similar style, not the sturdiest build, but he does pack the power, and he is crafty. Francis Ngannou recently left the UFC, being unsatisfied with the contract that he was offered, and it looks as though he may potentially go into boxing. There was talk of him getting a big exhibition fight against Tyson Fury, and that may very well happen if Fury doesn't end up fighting Usyk or AJ. Like Wilder, he has that one-punch knockout power that can take him far, regardless of any extensive technical skills, which he's not exactly going to bring to the table, given that he has no amateur boxing experience, but he is a born fighter with a lot of power. And we can't completely forget the Klitschko brothers, even though they're both retired. Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Ukraine, along with his brother Vladimir, have been very active in the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. They've certainly had their hands full with that, certainly proving good patriotism, standing up for their country, being on the front lines, and speaking out in defense of their country. It remains to be seen if we'll ever see them back in the ring. If we do, it'll probably be in the form of an exhibition, but I'm just throwing it out there. That's a possibility. Finally, as I close here, some matchups I'd like to see. I think we would all like to see Tyson Fury against Usyk. And even though Tyson Fury versus AJ is the biggest money fight perhaps, I like Fury versus Usyk because it's the two best guys in the division. Ultimately, I don't think there's anyone I would pick against Fury, but who knows? Fury can have an off night, he can be unpredictable, and Usyk certainly brings the technical prowess to the table. The biggest fight to make several years ago was Anthony Joshua against Deontay Wilder. But recently, with them both suffering devastating losses, Wilder suffering those losses to Tyson Fury, those stoppage losses, that stoppage loss and the big knockout loss in the third fight, AJ having the devastating upset loss to Ruiz, bouncing back and being Ruiz, but then losing twice to Usyk. They're not quite at the top of the division like they once were, but they are just a step below Fury and Usyk right now. And I think suddenly that's a very, very intriguing fight to make again, because they're both in a kind of a must-win situation if they want to stay at this level, and it's a good style matchup still. So I think AJ and Wilder is still a very good fight. If Joe Joyce gets past Zhang Zhilei in his next fight, which is not the biggest if, Zhang certainly provides a challenge. If he gets past that, I wouldn't mind seeing a rematch with Dubois. A healthy, injury-free Dubois, I think that's a great fight still. And I think Dillian Whyte would be a good fight as well. I think I would like to see Joyce win one more big fight against a solid contender before I put him in there against someone like the best of the best, like Fury or Usyk or AJ or Wilder. Ultimately, I think his defensive vulnerabilities catch up to him, but if you don't get him out of there early, odds aren't in your favor. If there's any prospects you'd like me to talk about further, ones that you think I might have missed, let me know. Let me know what matchups you want to see, what predictions. And until next time, I will see you in the third installment of the series when I break down the welterweight division. Until next time, JoeBox TV out.